I'm Andrew Hall, and this is Dead Hand Radio. My guest for this episode is Graeme Rendall, UFO researcher, historian, author, and activist for the UFO disclosure movement. He also writes for the Debrief, Shadows of Your Mind magazine, and UAP Media UK. His first book, To the Ends of the Earth, A Snapshot of Aviation in North Eastern Siberia, is a 428-page expose with over 200 photographs which document his excursion to the former Soviet Union during the summer of 1992. Because of his extensive research on Soviet-era aircraft, Graeme is considered by many to be a scholar of aviation history. His most recent project is an extended examination of documented cases and eyewitness testimonies of the phenomenon known as Foo Fighters. This investigation has led him to World War II archives from several countries throughout Europe, including Nazi Germany and occupied territories of the 1930s and 40s. We'll talk about his findings, as well as his research methods and some of the obstacles he's encountered during his research, and much more. Welcome back to Dead Hand Radio, Graeme.
Hello, Andrew. Nice to see you again. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. How accurate was that intro? Was that pretty good?
Perfect. Thank you. The check will be in the post.
Right, man. I wish, but save your money, man. Spend it on those documents and the travel to go uncover the deep, dark secrets of the archives.
Will do.
We'll get into that stuff really quick, but I always like to give a guest an opportunity to share a little bit about their background, just a brief summary of, what got you started into the UFO topic and how did it result in this extensive research into the Foo Fighter topic?
Okay, yeah. So my UFO interest started about 8 or 9 years old. I was already a voracious reader of aircraft books by that stage. And I got into science fiction at about 8 or 9. And I started reading things like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov. And the books had fairly lurid covers of spacecraft. And my mum thought she was doing me a favor one day, and she bought me a book that had a picture of a spacecraft on the front of it. But it turned out to be a book on UFOs. And it rather than being a fiction book, it was a non-fiction book, or at least purporting to be a non-fiction book about people's experiences and what they'd seen, going back from the days of the Bible right through to the present day as it was then, back in about 1975, 1976. And I got hooked because I was obviously reading about spacecraft and imaginary kind of craft and vehicles and things operating in space, but this was supposed to be real, about flying saucers and UFOs coming to the Earth. So it was very intriguing, and the interest just spiraled from there. I had a sighting at about 12 or 13-year-old. I still don't remember the exact date or year, of a teardrop-shaped craft on its side, and it was orange and silver. It was flying very, very slowly, some distance away, and it went by in a cloud. And the experience lasted for probably less than a minute. But so that was something I also had in my childhood. Talk about the Foo Fighters and the interest I've got in that goes back to my interest in aviation, which started about from 4-year-old, when my mum bought me model kits to keep me quiet. And I used to read the instructions, and they had little histories of the airplanes that I was building on these sheets. And of course, that just being a sponge for knowledge, that just increased my curiosity, my willingness to read about airplanes. So the two things sort of combined when I realized that pilots in World War II, because that became another interest. The pilots in World War II were seeing these strange balls of light flying around, but the documentation and the actual list of encounters in the books I was reading in the 70s and 80s, there was hardly anything about the Foo Fighters. Either the authors would skip over the topic, or there'd be maybe 1 or 2 lines or a paragraph if you were lucky. So it was very scant information, and it was always about the same thing. It was always about a specific time and a specific Air Force and a specific section of the Air Force that saw these things. And I just wondered whether that was all there was to it. And then obviously a little while ago, I realized that there was a lot more to this. And actually it wasn't just the established wisdom that you read about in these books. There was actually a lot more to it than that. So this is where my interest stemmed from.
Yeah, and I would say that just a little bit of reading of the work that you've done on Foo Fighters is going to illustrate to anybody who's interested that it is much more than simply balls of light that were buzzing around Allied aircraft during the World War II period. There's a heck of a lot more to it, and we're definitely going to get into some of that. You and I first met on Twitter. We share an interest in the Cold War, in history, aviation in particular, and you spent time in the former Soviet Union territories, looking at
That's right.
Soviet era airplanes. We did a whole episode about that, so I don't want to rehash that. If anybody wants to see it or listen, I think that was a podcast episode before I went on started doing video. I don't actually remember, but I'll find a link to that and put it in the show notes. But you about that time when we had that interview is when I first heard you talk about the Foo Fighter, your interest in the Foo Fighters, and since then you've done a ton of research and actually visited several countries. Have you actually gone to those countries?
No, COVID has put a kind of a spanner in the works in terms of being able to visit archives as concerned. So a lot of it's been done, well, most of it's been done online, but there's actually a vast amount of resources you can find. It's surprising what you can get your teeth into and what you can dig into just by internet access. So we can get into that in a minute. In terms of like when I first started like looking at this more in depth, then it was actually before I spoke to you. I was already writing by that stage and accumulating resources and information, but it was sort of slow going to start with. And you've got to start somewhere anyway. But I managed to get access to a few archives, both in Britain and in America, and that really speeded things up in terms of what information I could get a hold of, and more information on just some of the established cases which I was already aware of. But then that led to me being able to find other cases, and a lot more besides the ones that are sort of more known, even like by researchers, because there are a handful of fairly famous cases from the war which have made the literature and which are sort of known around people. But there's a hell of a lot more than that as well.
One of the first places I would recommend people to check out some of your work is the Debrief article that you wrote. I'll go ahead and put a link in the chat window in case anybody wants to check it out. But it's also on your link tree, which is available on your Twitter account.
It is.
That's a pretty good overview, and you actually detail a couple of the cases that you've uncovered, and it really it kind of like demystifies the idea that these things were only light balls or whatever you call those things, balls of light, or there was much more to it, and they weren't only in over Germany. They were in other areas, even in Africa and in the Pacific. Excuse me.
Yeah. So the accepted wisdom basically stemmed from a magazine article in a publication called the American Legion magazine. And in their December 1945 issue, there was a chap by the name of Joe Chamberlain, and he published an article, and it had about half a dozen different case reports, and they were very brief. They were less than a paragraph each. There were a couple of lines basically, and they were taken from the war diary of one particular squadron, the 415th Light Fighter Squadron, which was based in eastern France at the time, and they were flying over western Germany, near the Ruhr, like sort of Cologne, Dusseldorf, Aachen area, and they were coming across these things almost every night, and there were balls of fire at that time, and this time frame was about end of November 1944, and right through to about March 1945. And this Joe Chamberlain, he wasn't mentioned as such in the article in December 45, but he was actually an aide to General Arnold, who was the head of the US Army Air Force at the time, and the actual commander-in-chief, the head honcho. So, and he was tasked with a fact-finding mission, not about Foo Fighters, just to see what morale and kind of conditions were like at the front. And he happened to go to one of these squadrons, and he wanted to go for a flight, but they couldn't. They weren't, couldn't take him up. And he started talking to the crew, and they were telling him the stories about this kind of thing. So he got really interested in it, and he had access, being General Arnold's aide, to a lot of the intelligence documents. And he just got a hold of maybe half a dozen of these and put them in this article, because there was a lot of newspaper talk at the time about these strange, they called them silver balls that the daylight raids were seeing in autumn 44, but also these new Foo Fighters. And they did actually make the likes of Newsweek and Time and all the rest of it. And in January 1945, there were newspaper articles, and right through the winter as well. So there was some public awareness of what was going on overseas, but also at the same time they were seeing them in the Pacific. I don't get into that in the book I'm writing, but at the same time they were happening there. But going back to France, so those particular reports were only from one squadron, and in only one particular time frame, a very narrow window of time, from November 44 through to about March, maybe April 1945. And that's where this legend of the Foo Fighters was built up, about them being just these red balls of light that either followed aircraft or were seen in a distance. And that's where the UFO authors from the 50s and 60s and even at the 70s and 80s got their information from, because there were very few references to any other cases that happened at any other time of the war, or to any other air forces. The Royal Air Force or the Luftwaffe or the Japanese, you name it. There was very, very few cases. So this myth, this legend was built up over years and years about the Foo Fighters just being particular types of light happening, being experienced by one particular squadron or a very small number of American night fighter squadrons in a particular part of Europe. And nobody questioned it because there was no information around.
Yeah. Jack Hetfield is in the chat. He says, "What's up, Andrew? It's awesome to have Graeme Rendall, GR, on the show. He's one of the most credible voices in the UFO world." And I agree with that, Jack. Thank you for your comment. I totally agree with that. Real quick, your audio is a little bit sketchy.
Sorry.
Your video is really fuzzy. So I'm not sure if there's anything you could do to improve the quality of the connection, but if you could,
I would just drop out and drop back in again, possibly.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Go for it. So Graeme is just trying to fix his internet connection so that we can have a quality show for you guys, and he'll be right back as soon as he gets here. There we go. See if that works.
Yeah.
We also had Gerald Greenwood drop in. He's in the chat. Hi, guys. If you're taking questions at any point, I'd like to ask Graeme if he feels there's a direct connection between the Foo Fighters and modern phenomenon like the Tic Tac.
I can get into that. No problem.
Absolutely. We will definitely get into that. Before we do, I stole a quote from the article you wrote in the debrief.
Oh, yeah.
Because I thought it was a great illustration of what we were talking about just now. What is not widely known is that lights were not the only items air crews reported seeing. Huge cylindrical objects with portals, inverted bathtubs, and huge blankets were also sighted. And that's something that I don't think a lot of people, when you think of Foo Fighters, you don't think about those kind of anomalies.
So the Foo Fighters themselves, the name itself was coined by one particular crewman. He was a radar observer belonging to one particular squadron. And he coined it one day after being sort of confronted with one of these things over on a night mission. And then they landed, and the intelligence officer was talking to them about it, like probably not believing exactly what they were saying. What did you really see? What did you see up there? And he pulled this comic out of his back pocket and slammed it down on the intelligence officer's desk and shouted, "It's one of those Foo Fighters, but the first word wasn't. Yeah, it rhymed with duck. So okay, so but they sanitized the name for the newspapers. So the name was coined in November 1944. But in terms of balls of light, because the phenomenon has gone under different names at different times by different air forces, that just happened to be the American name for it. But actually, the American crews have been seeing them at night for months beforehand. Some of the first reports from some of the night fighter squadrons go back as early as September 1944. So this is where you get away from this legend that was built up. Before that, in the daytime, the American daylight raids over Germany, some of the crews were seeing silver balls. They were seeing some other weird and wonderful looking things as well. There's a whole variety of stuff, even too many probably to get into here. But they were being seen as early as 1943 when the first raids over Germany took place. And then if you want to go to the RAF, the Royal Air Force, the first case I can find is March 1942. And it was a luminous orange kind of copper-colored disc that followed a bomber, and they actually opened fire at it. And then nothing happened. The bullets went into it, whatever this thing was, and just disappeared. There was no damage recorded. The object or the light, whatever it was, because it was just a light. It didn't move away. It didn't fall in flames. It just sat there behind the airplane with his gunner firing at it every so often. And then it moved around to the side of the airplane and sat off the wingtip. And it got to a position where both the tail turret and the nose turret could actually turn and fire at it together, more or less. And then they started opening fire at it again, and nothing happened. And it then moved around to the front of the aircraft, and the nose gunner started firing at it, and then it just shot off into the distance.
Yeah, that's there's been a lot of speculation that these Foo Fighters and UFOs in general that we're seeing during the World War II were advanced technology or aircraft developed by the Nazis at that time.
I've looked at that.
What you just described right there does not. It does not seem like it would be possible for them to develop that type of advanced technology.
In the book, I've gone into a reasonable amount of detail as to why that can't be the case. As I say before, I've been interested in aircraft since I was 4-year-old. I've had a developing interest in German secret weapons from a fairly early age as well, from about the ages of 9 and 10. I actually did a high school project on advanced German jet projects. That was a project I did for a particular exam when I was 16-year-old. So I was into that kind of thing then, and that interest's never gone away. So I've got a fair bit of knowledge about German jet aircraft, both built and planned, and also from the missile projects that they actually built, tested, never put into production, because they never ever got one operational, and also whole other ones that they planned as well. And nothing right across the field of things that were either built, planned, or even just dreamt up ever could fit the bill of a Foo Fighter. They simply didn't have that kind of technology. At the end of the war, just for like a slight example, for the people who were sort of think that, they probably had some really secret project squirreled away somewhere, and they were throwing lots of resources at it to get a disc-shaped aircraft like a UFO flying, or some kind of little spherical aerial flak mine that one particular author suggested might be the thing behind the Foo Fighters. They didn't have that kind of the possibility of doing that. The industry was smashed from the daylight raids. The big aircraft factories were basically being split out between loads of little workshops, and then the parts were being built in one place, and then they were coming together from 100 different places and then getting put together in even sometimes in forest factories, for God's sake, to put them together into aircraft and then flying them, or they were putting them into underground factories. Half of them weren't finished, but they were still building things in tunnels, and it was all kind of very, very haphazard. There was always a shortage of people and materials and workshop space to build these things, and the designers always liked to tinker with the designs. So no sooner had they actually built something or had something on the drawing board that they were looking at ways of improving it. and making it do like 100 different tasks in the air, which slowed everything down. They had this weird and wonderful way of designing aircraft. So there was a lot of things that hindered them. But in terms of jet engine design, they were going back to pulse jets for the final designs for fighter aircraft. And this is about the turn of the start of 1945. They had an emergency crash program to build a very lightweight, cheap jet fighter. But rather than have advanced turbojets, like they would sort of come up with about that time, they went back to pulse jets, which powered the V-1 flying bomb. Now, I don't know if you know anything about pulse jets, but you can't take off with one because they don't deliver enough power to be able to get you off the ground. They're like a ramjet. You have to be flying at 150 to 200 mile an hour before they become effective. So they have to be either catapult launched, or it has to have a rocket motor to get it up into the air before the pulse jet will work. So they were going backwards in terms of what they were building and what they were asking for. And there's other reasons as well, but there's a whole variety of things that the Germans simply couldn't have come up with these kind of weapons. And actually, there's no proof either. There's not a scrap of evidence, not even like a requisition for materials, a requisition for a workshop or testing facilities, or just putting something in a wind tunnel to see whether it would actually fly. Nothing like that exists at all for either a disc-shaped aircraft, like a Nazi UFO, or one of these things that were supposedly nicknamed Fireball or Kugelblitz, these automatic, what they're called aerial flak mines that were supposed to go up and knock bombers down by strange concoctions of gases, which were supposedly knock out the ignition systems in aircraft engines. That was one thing.
But the flak mines is something that's a point of interest to talk about, because those would go up, explode, and cause a visual effect in the air
theory.
that could be misidentified as something else. But they didn't behave. Those flak mines did not behave the same way that these Foo Fighters and other.
Well, they were never built, Andrew. It's a figment of an Italian author's imagination.
It was never built.
They were never built.
Okay.
But yet, there's a lot of people in over the last sort of 20 years on the internet, and even in some books, have put forward these things as being fact. But it was dreamt up basically by an Italian who wrote a book in the early 1950s. The book was never published until 1968 in Italian. It was an English translation about a year later. But people have seized upon this thing because he had these two secret, hitherto known secret weapons. And again, there's no proof of them whatsoever anywhere in the records. Effectively, he made them up. But people have latched onto it as being a kind of explanation for the Foo Fighters, in the same way that people talk about Nazi UFOs, that Hornebu or the Vril flying saucers as being that was what the Foo Fighters were. It's all, to use an English phrase, bollocks, basically. It just didn't.
So since you mentioned the Hornebu, and I also want to talk about those a little bit later on.
Sure.
Before we get to that, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. What you were saying about where the Nazi Air Force was as far as developing new technology toward the end of the war.
Yeah,
they had a lot of restrictions on what they could put out there, but they were still the most advanced Air Force as far as technological advancements in the world at that time. There was nobody else doing what they were doing. So if their best was in the air, and it wasn't even close to what the Foo Fighters, we're just using that term to describe everything that's anomalous in the air. But yeah, it wasn't even close to what the Foo Fighters were capable of. So you can't go back and say, well, maybe it was the Russians, maybe it was the Americans that were putting the stuff out there. Top secret British Air Force.
Definitely not.
Technology, right? So it was either the Germans or it was something else.
So there's something strange about the Germans, because you talk about the technology, the advanced technology that they were demonstrating. So they had jet fighters and they had rocket-propelled fighters, which were operational. They had two particular types. One was a jet, one was a rocket. And they both started to see service in about July 1944. So the jet was the Messerschmitt 262. It was a twin-engine, single-seat fighter. And the rocket aircraft was the Messerschmitt 163 Comet, which was a very, very small tailless aircraft, which was rocket powered, had a it took off on a wheeled dolly, which it jettisoned on takeoff. It could climb at 12,000 feet a minute. It had an endurance of about 7 minutes, and then it ran out of fuel and had to glide back to base. So it was a desperation measure. But these two particular types of aircraft, they were the most advanced that the Germans had, that they could field in combat, even up to the end of the war. But they never flew at night. At least the Me-262 did, but much later on. And both types were actually seen, or rather reported, by RAF bomber crews at night in sort of October, November 1944. And they were both reported as being engaged and shot down sometimes. So this is another facet of the Foo Fighter kind of business, as to what were the actual bomber crews seeing, what were they shooting down? Because they damn well weren't shooting down jet fighters or rocket fighters, because they didn't exist at night. Mm-hmm. And yet the combat, I've seen the combat reports in the National Archives, and they do mention about Me-163s and Me-262s being shot down. So what were the Germans throwing up? Or indeed, if they weren't these, it's more likely that they were fast-moving lights, because some of the intelligence files talk about, I use the word Foo Fighters all through the book about, as you say, about this entire phenomenon all the way through, because it covers a load of different things. But originally, in 1942, they were called meteors or rockets. And then they started just being called lights or the thing by the crews. And then they started calling them jets, because there's actually an intelligence report that says about the transition between the different things they called them. And really, all they were just very, very fast-moving lights. At night, when you would see a light, the first thing they thought they were seeing was a night fighter, because that was what they were conditioned to see. If you saw a light coming up behind your aircraft, it was going to be a German night fighter. There was no two ways about it. They weren't looking at UFOs. That was outside their radar, was outside their experience. That term and those things wouldn't come along for another couple of years, well after the war anyway. So everything they saw was going to be a German or a German secret weapon. So sometimes also when at night, when they were just seeing a light, the mind would fill in the blanks, and they would think they would see an aircraft behind it as well, but half the time they weren't, or they were just seeing lights, very, very bright lights that moved around. And of course, in that case of that March 1942 one, there wasn't any craft behind it anyway. It was just a very, very bright light that flew around the airplane. Some of the intelligence reports from 1942 from the Bomber Command's, what they call the Operational Research Section, and you can see these files in the archives, they have huge analysis on lights that followed airplanes, and have tables of how many times it happened over a course of a month, and whether, well, they couldn't identify the aircraft that had them. That means there was something there, but they didn't know what the hell they were. And of course, when you think about it, why would a night fighter have a light on anyway? Why would you advertise where you were to a potential enemy? Why would you creep up behind a bomber to shoot it down and have a light on?
In fact, the opposite is true. That's why fighter pilots often take a high ground and come out of the sun, because the sun will mask their position until they get close enough to open fire. They're not going to project or broadcast their position until they get close enough to attack.
And the things at nighttime, it was even different, because what they would do is for RAF bombers, they would creep up from underneath, because our bombers didn't have ball turrets underneath the aircraft like the B-17 or the B-24 did. Some versions had what they called scare guns. It was like one machine gun that somebody would open fire occasionally, but they didn't have turrets underneath. And what the Germans would do, they'd just come up from behind and shoot the aircraft. But some of the reports say from the air crews themselves, and you've got to go through the air crew reports to see what they said. A lot of the time they said they would see lights, or they called them headlights, because they were so bright. And sometimes they said they were attached to single-engined aircraft. Now, for a long time, until about 1943 or so, the Germans didn't use single-engined aircraft at night in the night fighter role. That a desperation measure, they did eventually, but they didn't have radar on board, because the aircraft were too small to fit the radar into, airborne radar. So they were just flying around, being controlled from the ground by radio, or if they were lucky enough to see a bomber caught in the searchlights, then they were going to try and go and attack it. And that's what they did. But there was no room in the front of a single-engine aircraft to put a headlight in, or any kind of light really, because there was no room. So if you think of a Messerschmitt 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190, the two main single-engine German types, the engine took up the front of the airplane, and then you had the propeller. So there was no room to put a light in, and also a gun fired through the propeller, a cannon fired through the propeller itself, because there was a little hole in the middle. So for the muzzle, so there was no room there either, even in the propeller boss. So it was physically impossible to put a light anywhere on the front of a single engine fighter, and yet they were being reported. So what were they seeing? They were seeing something else. They were just seeing a light, and of course their minds were filling in the blanks. And this happened quite a lot. And it got to the point that the Operation Research Section just got to the point where they just couldn't get any further. They had all these reports of lights following airplanes. Sometimes the lights were following them for 60 or 70 miles over a 50-minute period. And this is documented. But there were no further, like, trying to work out what the hell was going on months after this started. But then the reports stopped because they couldn't get anywhere, and it was a waste of their time trying to work it out, because the lights didn't attack, they weren't opening fire, and in none of these cases were these lights ever resolve as airplanes which they started to open fire at the bombers. They were just lights, and they didn't do anything hostile. So the analysis still went, okay, well, nothing's happening, they're not hostile, we'll put the intelligence gathering expertise to something that's more tangible, and they just forgot about it for a while. But even so, all this still went on.
Okay. I want to get to a follow-up question on that, but before I do that, I want to welcome Catherine Chetney to the chat room. Thank you for being here, Catherine. Please ask about pilots seeing Padre Pio flying in the air, waving his arms and blocking their bombing doors from opening.
Well, that's an interesting one. Sounds like a gremlin or something.
It does sound like a gremlin, yeah. Do you know anything about that incident?
I'm afraid I don't. I've never come across that before. I wonder if that's something that's to do with the Pacific War. It's something I haven't looked at yet. I will look into that, though, because that's a really interesting sort of stuff. That sounds like a kind of superstition thing, like a gremlin accounting for technical failures. But yeah, that's something I'll definitely look at. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. That's an interesting point you brought up. So my follow-up question to the lights, the nighttime lights more specifically, is how well developed was the radar of that time, of that period? Wasn't it in the very beginning stages of developing active radar? So
the German radar itself, if you've ever seen pictures of German aircraft with the aerials on the front of the airplanes, it wasn't like a scanner like you see on a modern fighter aircraft that revolves, goes from side to side kind of thing. These were dipole aerials. They were literally like the aerials you see on an old house with a TV set from the 50s or the 60s. And the Germans actually nicknamed them mattresses because they looked like a kind of mast, an array of just like metal poles sticking out the front of an airplane. In fact, they were so big and bulky that they usually reduced the speed of the airplane by about 50 miles an hour. So they increased a lot of drag on the airframe. And you didn't get a radar scope like you would see in the movies or the TV, where the scan goes round in circles and it picks up a contact. It didn't work that way. You got a scope which it looked like an oscilloscope. It was just a moving kind of dot, or a kind of a series of lines that moved up and down. And from that, they had to try and translate what was going on, both for speed and distance. And that was the same even on the Allied side as well. They didn't have that kind of sophisticated equipment until later in the war. A bit later on, the Allies produced an airborne radar set, which did actually have a scanner. So they had a proper nose cone in the aircraft, which the scanner kind of thing fitted into. So we were a little bit more ahead of them, but still not to the point of where you had a huge coverage. The range was only a few miles, maybe 6, 7, 8 miles kind of thing. And the thing about the Foo Fighters were they were never picked up on radar anyway, either by the ground or by the air.
Question.
That was going to be the next question,
that
right?
Was the next question. So now, was it because they were actively jamming, or the technology just wasn't as advanced enough to pick up that type
if it was
of
jamming, if it was both sides actually jammed each other's equipment. The jamming was known as a science. They used like strips of aluminium foil called window, and the Germans had it as well, but they were both sort of afraid to use it in case they was copied, because nobody wanted to blot out radar because it was quite useful to both sides. They did actually end up using it. We used it first. But so they did actually have a way of jamming, but jamming could be seen on screens. You could tell what it was because it was just false returns, and that was about as sophisticated as they got. So they weren't doing spot jamming or some of the sophisticated stuff they do nowadays. It was just like a very, very crude attempt of just blanket jamming everything. But you could tell, and some of the more talented radar observers could almost see around some of the echoes because they showed slightly different characteristics, the false ones. So some of the German controllers claimed that they could actually see around some of the jamming in certain conditions, and that's possible that happened. But radar was very crude. The German system was ground stations with elaborate kind of networks of controllers talking by radio to the aircraft and the night fighters in the sky. They had a system, what they called boxes, where there was one aircraft in each box in a line across Europe, where the bombers would fly over, and then wherever they came, then the individual night fighters would be assigned to the aircraft flying through their particular area. So it was quite an elaborate system. It ended up at the point where it was too unwieldy to work, but it did work for a while. And then we had obviously radar as well in terms of Britain. We had air defense radar, but we also had airborne radar first. It was fairly crude. So the range wasn't great, maybe 10 miles if you were lucky. But they did use it quite well to shoot German night fighters down, because we had our own night fighters accompanying the bombers sometimes. The bombers themselves had navigation radar, so they could see that was a scanner that was underneath the airplane, and it was good enough that it could see, or see inverted commas, ground features such as lakes and rivers. So it was quite useful for navigation, but also for bombing as well, for bombing navigation. The Americans had a similar system that they nicknamed Mickey, which was based on exactly the same process. It was actually just a variation of the same design. And the Germans came up with responses to all these things. So they were trying to use countermeasures, and they were coming up with their own airborne radar. But it was a little bit less sophisticated. But they both had it, but they weren't picking up the Foo Fighters. There's anecdotal evidence that the Germans were seeing these too, but I've never come across proper reports yet about the Luftwaffe pilots. I've never seen any documentation yet. So that's a bit of a kind of bugbear of mine, that you keep hearing about people saying, oh yeah, well the Germans saw them as well. Yeah, but I need proof of that, because I haven't found any. I've seen some stories of individual crew one who claimed to see it, and another one from a French book in the 1970s, which I've sort of proved as a hoax in my book. But I'm leaving that for the book for people to read. But there's no kind of pilot interrogations after the war or reports that you can find in the archives. So there's a bit of a dearth of information on that side. And I keep getting people telling me that, oh yeah, the Germans saw them too when I put stuff on Twitter. But I keep asking them, well, can you show me where this is? And then you never get anything from them. So it's a bit frustrating, actually, that side of things.
So I'm going to follow up on that.
I see what you said, yeah.
But Catherine, let me just read this out. Catherine Chatney says, so this is in reference to Padre Pio. He's a Catholic saint with stigmata. There are pictures of him with pilots having dinner. It was fighting over Italy, World War II, and there's a follow-up.
I'm afraid I've never, ever heard of that, but I will chase that up. It just sounds interesting.
Bernardo Rossini, a general of the Italian Air Force, was one of the witnesses. Okay, so it's a cool link to spirituality. Thank you, Catherine. Now, the follow-up that I had to the Luftwaffe encounters with the Foo Fighters, and there being a lack of evidence to support that. Are there any records still left after Berlin was literally leveled to the ground? Would there be any possibility of records from the Luftwaffe still available?
They're supposed to be, yeah. There's some got lost at the end of the war, but the Americans, your side managed to take a lot of the stuff that was there, and there's quite a lot in the National Archives. So, okay. Yeah. But the thing is, it's trying to find the actual documentation, because even in the RAF and the US Army Air Force records, you can't just look up Foo Fighters and find something. you have to be very clever, and you have to just look up individual squadron records and look for mission records. And sometimes they're not in there either, or sometimes they're not in the form that just looking for something for Foo Fighters who actually recognize what was going on. So it's very difficult to try and see.
So I actually might be able to point you in the direction to get some help with searching those National Archives. Are you familiar with Thomas Whitmore?
No, I'm not.
Okay, he's a good friend of mine, and he does extensive research into the MG12 documents,
Okay.
and that whole, the whole process of disinformation related to the UFO topic. He actually used to live in West Virginia near the National Archives, and he would go there all the time. He's moved back to Texas, but he's very familiar. I think he has some contacts at the National Archives too. So if you could point him to the the search terms that you're looking for, I think he might be able to help you with that search. I'll put you and him in contact so that you guys can talk and maybe find something out about it.
It's funny that, like I say, there's all this anecdotal kind of evidence of people saying, "Oh yes, I saw them too," and you see that in a lot of literature as well. But for some reason, people never followed it up. But that's the thing that's happened since the 1950s. I know I said before that the legend has built up around a time frame which was quite narrow in focus, and also in terms of units and witnesses. But here and there in the 1950s and 1960s, some stories beyond that time frame did come up. And there were stories from 1942 and 1943 that did actually end up in very niche publications that researchers were looking at, and they were supplying the information. So things like Flying Saucer Review, the famous UK publication, but also from Len Stringfield's CRIFO, which was a civilian saucer investigation kind of society, and he produced a newsletter in the 1950s. And I found cases on both of those, but at the same time, these cases were never followed up. Or if they were very unsuccessful because no information ever came to light. There was no follow-up with the witnesses to try and find more witnesses in terms of the crews, because these were bomber aircraft. So some of the other other positions in the aircraft, the gunners or the navigator or even sometimes the pilot, they weren't the witnesses. But the people who weren't then cross-questioned, or they weren't followed up with other questions, or there was no attempt to try and contact other members of the crew to find out some corroboration. So there was an opportunity missed back then, and I can't help thinking that people were just interested in the current cases then, and they weren't interested in the wartime cases, even though these cases were quite compelling in terms of what happened. Because one of these cases was the one where this object or this light was fired at. And yet nobody seemed to go any further than just the pilot's testimony, because it was actually the pilot who came forward as a witness in 1962. But there was no attempt made to follow it up and talk to him about it. And it just seemed an opportunity missed, I'm afraid.
It is a little mystifying that they didn't do more due diligence. But you're talking about these type of publications. They're privately ran. They're not they don't have big budgets. They're probably taking submissions from third parties, rather than having a trained journalist go out and do the research and investigate the topic. So it's understandable. Like you said, it's a lost opportunity. A reference to the records that you have searched, and I'm sure you've had to do extensive research. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, how many records have you had to go through to uncover just the minutest details that you've found? And how do you go about getting those records?
It's two different places I've managed to find most of them. So we have the National Archives in the UK, and because of COVID, they've opened a lot of stuff out to people to get off the internet rather than have to go down to the archives and physically go through the files. Being able to download things for free as well, so that's cut down a lot of the cost. So and that's in terms of squadron records for the Royal Air Force, and they're quite thorough. You'll have, each squadron had 2 different files for each month that it was operating, and they're called operational records. And they'll have a record of events, and there's a summary of events. And the records themselves are quite patchy. So some of the established squadrons at the start of the war seem to have very little to say in terms of what happened for a mission. Occasionally, the squadron, whoever was writing these reports up for the official records, would just do a summary of the raid. So each individual aircraft and their crews wouldn't get an individual report. There would just be literally maybe half a dozen paragraphs for the whole raid, and that would cover everybody that participated. Sometimes it was anything up to 20 aircraft from one squadron. And then some other squadrons were really good, especially some of the newly formed squadrons. And some of the Dominion squadrons, so the Canadian squadrons or the South African squadrons, they were really good in terms of reporting. And each individual crew would have its own paragraph as to what happened that raid. And you wouldn't just get the time of takeoff and the landing or the bomb load, but you'd also get things about what kind of conditions were like over the target, and if they saw night fighters, and if what happened. And this is where you find these reports of the Foo Fighters, or the things that would later be called the Foo Fighters. So these things that we're calling rockets. There's a lot of report of rockets being seen from 1942 onwards. Now the Germans didn't actually deploy an operational flak rocket. They didn't get that far. They had about 4 different types in development, but none of them were good enough, or they were too fragile, or their rocket motors didn't work, or their guidance systems didn't work, all 3, that they never put into service. So they couldn't be seen rockets because none of them existed. They did have a decoy rocket that fired flares, but it could only get to 8,000 feet. Now these crews were seeing rockets flying past their aircraft at 22,000 feet, 25,000 feet sometimes. So it wasn't this decoy rocket that the Germans had, because they couldn't get that high. So you wonder what they were seeing. So those reports are actually in the official files, but it's just a question of going through them. I'll get to the point about how many records in a minute. And then sometimes the summary itself, which was more to do with the admin of the squadron and about how people came in and out of the squadron, or injuries, or things that happened on the sports field or the mess, or things like that, all the stuff around the raids themselves. Sometimes they're a minor information as well, because often you got information about the raid itself that never appeared in the official individual logs, but sometimes appeared in the summary, so you have to check both of them. And of course, that's quite a painstaking process, because each file would be something like 30 pages. And there are quite a few bomber squadrons, like 100 or more, that were flying operations over Germany from Britain, or sometimes the ones that were based in Italy were flying over the Balkans and northern Italy and Austria as well, from about 1944 onwards. So there's quite a lot of squadrons to go through. So I must have gone through, I don't know, tens of thousands of pages just looking for our RAF records. Funnily enough, I remember that you can actually look at the South African Air Force records as well for the same time, because they had squadrons in operating out of Italy as well, flying over places like Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary and Austria. And I found cases in their reports as well. I found the last ones just yesterday. I was looking through, so I'm still tinkering on doing research. So yeah, thousands and thousands of pages of reports.
So you said there were 2 places where you were getting most of the archives from.
That was the first one, yeah.
The National Archives, the UK National Archives.
Second one is you guys at Maxwell Air Force Base, and that's the Air Force Historical Records Agency. They've been brilliant. In fact, there's been cases I haven't been able to get out of the National Archives that I've been able to get from the American side instead, and they are actually British records.
Wow.
The Americans actually hold them as well, and I found that it was easier to use the same search terms in the AFHRA records, and I came up with them. Now this is to do with intelligence records and to do with Bomber Command's operational research section and what they called flak liaison reports. Both the US Army Air Force and the RAF pooled resources to produce what they called flak liaison reports. And that was basically to work out what the anti-aircraft defenses over Germany were like. And it was a series of monthly reports as to what happened. So what type of anti-aircraft defense there were, what the effectiveness of the flak itself was like, and what they called phenomena. They actually had that term, and it was a subsection of each report they would call phenomena. And then it would list all the other stuff not just the stuff they knew about, but all the stuff they didn't have a clue about. And that's where you find a lot of stuff about these silver discs, black discs, balloon-looking objects flying around much higher than balloons went at, and these lights as well at night. All those reports are in those sections, and it's a complete gold mine of information. Some of it's not immediately obvious, however. For a lot of it, you have to have a bit of a working knowledge about the war and about what happened and about where and when. But if you know that, then the rest's easy. But there's a lot of information in there. But also, not just the intelligence records. If you want to look at the American night fighter crew experiences, what they saw over Germany, what they saw over Italy as well, because it wasn't just over Germany. There was 2 night fighter units, American night fighter units based in Italy, who were seeing things up over the Po Valley as well in 1944 and 1945. So their unit records and also their war diaries are contained in the same archive. And it's quite easy to get a hold of those. And you can read through them. And every so often you'll get these references to balls of light. And then in the European, the French and Belgian-based units, they talk about Foo Fighters after a while. But that name didn't transfer to Italy until about February 1945. And then it starts appearing in the records then, even though they saw them much earlier than that. They didn't call them Foo Fighters until much later in the war. But so you can find the records as well.
To be clear on these records that you're researching, these are so old that you don't have to go through the FOIA process at all, right?
Nope, not at all. I haven't had to do that once yet. Yeah, they're publicly available, and best of all, they're free. Even the Air Force records in America have never charged me. I get reels of scanned microfilm, and often they'll have like 1,500 pages on it for one reel.
So do you get physical? You get physical records sent to you?
No, I get an email, and it has a link to the DoD website. And it's a safe process to download the reel, but it's a scanned image of a microfilmed reel.
Are they PDF? Are they downloaded as?
They come as PDFs. That's right. So that they're huge files. It takes me quite a while to save them on the cloud when I do download them.
When you download them, are they OCR'd for you, or do you have to go through the OCR
No, you can't.
process?
No, that half the time you can hardly read them. They were written on kind of onion skin paper. Sometimes they're very flimsy, so the scans don't always come through.
You're seeing the text from the backside bleeding through the front
once
side.
or twice, and sometimes they're blurred, and sometimes the typewriter wasn't very good. The ink ribbon wasn't very. Excuse me, the ink ribbon wasn't very good. So a lot of times it's unreadable. But in the reporting parts, they are, they're still legible. So thankfully,
so what I'm getting at is you have all these records. You have tens of thousands of records.
Oh, easy, yeah.
To sort through. There's no way to use a search filter.
No, I've had to read through them all individually.
That's insane.
Yeah.
So and do you, when you're taking notes, are you referencing which document was?
Yes.
Where you found this information?
The book has over 1,000 footnotes with references, so it's fully documented. It tells you exactly where I got the information from in each case.
So if somebody wanted to do what you're doing, what's the most important characteristic or character personality trait would they have to have?
Being crazy, I think. Have some kind of one of those obsessive compulsive disorders. I think I have that anyway. I must admit, or just be anal retentive. Whichever one you want to pick, I'll fit into all of those. So
Just want to say hi to Scott Brown.
Hi, Scott.
Thanks for being here. He and I had a great conversation last night. We were talking about his own work. Is in he looks at a lot of photo and footage of UFOs. You guys are two of the most important researchers in ufology today, I think.
Well, I'm going to talk about photographs in a bit, if you don't mind, about the Foo Fighters. So that might interest Scott.
We'll absolutely get to that. I do have just a couple questions. I want to backtrack because we got way ahead of ourselves talking about the details. No, it's good. But I do want to backtrack just a little bit because I wanted to ask you, when you started your research on this topic, I mean, aside from when you were little and you got an interest, when you actually sat down and decided you're going to do this, what was your goal when you first started the project?
So there's two goals basically. I wanted to dispel the kind of legend that's been built up around the Foo Fighters, or as an overarching term, that there was much more to it than just that narrow time frame and just that narrow group of squadrons that saw these. That it was much wider than that, not just from the time, but also from the geographical location. And I haven't even touched the Pacific War because I don't have a particular interest in that at the moment, but I'm looking to probably do a book about that in the future as well, because I should cover that. But that was one goal, was to just expand it from what had, that accepted wisdom, if you like, that had been built over the last 40 years sort of thing. But the other is to dispel the notion that something mundane such as Nazi UFOs or these alleged flak mines could have been responsible for the UFOs, for the Foo Fighters rather, because that's another legend that's been built up over probably another 30 years, where these two different kind of strands of information, but they're both wrapped up in the same kind of cloth in terms of being a potential cause for the Foo Fighters. And you don't have to go very far on the internet if you put in the words Foo Fighters, UFO, to find all these things popping up, and they pop up as fact, except they're nothing, they're nothing like fact. There's no evidence at all to back up any of the assertions. And I've gone to town in the book about it.
Let me kind of pile on that right there. I'm sorry to interrupt you, and I'll let you get back to your point, but it's a very important point that needs to be made for researchers. When the first thing you're going to see when you start researching, well, if you type in Foo Fighters, you're going to get the band. Pages and pages of it. Yeah. So you have to type in Foo Fighters, World War II, or Nazi Foo Fighters, or you got to be a little bit more specific. But you're going to get directed to the History Channel, the Wikipedia archives. Do not stop your search there, because a lot of that information, Scott and I talked about this last night, a lot of the information there is either inaccurate or incomplete. So true. if you believe what you read in those spaces, you only have half and probably not even an accurate understanding of what the topic is all about. Continue your research. And there are also places where you can reach out to other researchers and collaborate with those researchers to help you point you in the right direction of where you're going. And these are kind of the steps that I really wanted to dig into with you, so we can help kind of inform, because if we want to go through this many records within the archives, there needs to be an army of researchers digging into this stuff as passionately and committed as you are, to bring this information to the surface and really educate the entire public about the whole topic. Would you agree with that? And would you like to add on anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just scraping the surface here. I've even said that as much in the book, that the cases that I cover, and there's quite a few of them, only scratches the surface in terms of what probably happened during World War II. Because not just the fact that I haven't been able to look through everything, but the files that I've looked at, as I said before, some of the reporting is sketchy in terms, or it's quite, some of it's quite methodical, and yet sometimes that information should be there, but it's not. It just depends on how good the clerks who are writing up the reports were. Sometimes it's how much went in, or the individual whims of the intelligence officers from various squadrons. One would be really good and quite, there'd be a lot of information there, and then the next squadron would have practically nothing. So there could be stuff there that actually would be quite germane to the topic, but it just for whatever reason isn't. But also, a lot of the time, pilots didn't report things because there was a ridicule and a stigma then about reporting lights in the sky. There was a lot
and that's pre-Roswell.
Right? Oh yeah.
I mean, that's before the giggle factor and the whole disinformation campaign came out.
So you get the crews would come back to base, and the first thing they'd do would be debriefed by the intelligence staff, and that was the first point of contact where they could give the story. And a lot of the times, and this is backed up by pilots saying as much, or crews saying as much, that the first thing the intelligence officer would say, "Have you been drinking on duty?" because they wouldn't believe them. Or they would say, you haven't seen anything, or that's just some German secret weapon. And they would either not pass it on, or they would, and then it got to the point where the part of the crews just wouldn't say anything anymore. Even if they'd seen them once or twice, they just wouldn't say stuff. That information never got into the records, because you can tell from some of the eyewitness accounts where the pilots or the other parts of the crew, the people in the crew, have reported these things. They don't appear in the official records either, because they've actually gone to the squadrons that they served with, looked through the official records, and for that raid and that aircraft in question, there is no mention of what they saw. So that never went into those official reports. Now, whether it went elsewhere is a different matter. And we all know about the story about post-war UFOs, about how, things were reported but never went into official records. So it happened back then as well. But also there were isolated incidents where things were reported and got passed up to high command, and I've got the evidence to prove it because those documents do exist. So it worked both ways, but it just depends on who you look at and which squadrons you look at as to how much information is there. So yes, it needs a big team of researchers doing a hell of a lot more than I'm just doing on my own, but also not just looking at the RAF records, but looking at the American records as well. Because bearing in mind, I've just gone through units where I know something happened, or I suspect something happened. There's far too many for me to go through all of the bomb groups and the fighter groups and the reconnaissance groups and all the rest of it. And I haven't even touched any of the anti-submarine squadrons. Somebody asked me the other day, it was actually Andy, who runs that UFO podcast. He asked me privately the other day, were any of these things saw shadowing convoys over the North Atlantic? I can't answer that because I haven't come across anything. I wouldn't be surprised, but I've never found any documentation yet. But then again, I haven't looked through those records. Again, that would be another tranche to look through.
That's a good point that we'll dig down deeper into, and that's kind of in relation to Gerald Greenwood's question that he asked earlier, if it was if there's any relation or similarities to the Tic Tac.
Okay, I'll answer him directly then. So Gerald, there was a report which I looked at. It was a Halifax bomber squadron, and they saw a torpedo-shaped object with no wings or tail
in the sky.
In the sky at night. But this is the only difference. It had a flame coming out the back end. So you would think from that it's possibly a rocket. But again, you go back to the thing about what I said about them being no operational rockets. And even the testing of rockets didn't happen in the area where this took place, nor did they use live bombers as targets for testing rounds. So you have to wonder what this thing they saw was. And actually, that wasn't the only instance where this kind of thing was seen. That report came from February 1945, but they'd already seen rockets as early, these kind of, what they called rockets, for want of a better phrase. They were basically just like very fast moving lights or small torpedo-shaped objects. They were seeing those as early as August 1942, so over the night skies of Europe. So they go back a long way. These things don't change too much, I think. I haven't really gone to town in the book in too much and trying to draw too many comparisons. But I think the more that the phrase I love to use, and I used it in the Debrief article, was the more UFOs change, the more they stay the same. The overall thing about they run rings around our aircraft, that's never changed. So whether it was in World War II and they were flying against P-61 Black Widows or Foo Fighters or whatever, and nowadays when they're running rings about F-18s, that's never changed at all. Whichever time frame you pick, they are much more advanced, whatever they is.
I just want to reiterate that Debrief article you wrote is a great place for anybody to start with this topic, because it does dispel a lot of the misinformation that you're going to run across when you look at the Wikipedia stuff or the History Channel stuff. Take a look at Graeme's Debrief article on Foo Fighters. Also, I just want to reiterate that Foo Fighters is a general term that's used to describe many different anomalies or phenomena that were encountered and experienced by World War II fighters from the earlier days of the war until the end of the war.
Yeah. So the The three things that you mentioned before, you talked about the 200-foot torpedo-shaped object with the portholes. You talked about the upturned bathtub and also the blanket. So I'll just quickly tell the audience what those were. The 200-foot long torpedo-shaped object was seen over northern Italy, over the Alps, in November 1942 by a bomber crew, and it was seen twice during the course of one night. And the second time it was seen, it was flying low up a mountain valley. But it was 200 foot long and it had portholes along the side. Now, what the hell was that?
Right.
Sort of thing.
A submarine?
Well, yeah, but people were seeing things that big as well. There was a few other instances where they were seeing things that were, 200 or 300 feet big, foot long. So that wasn't the only instance. But the memo from that incident about the report was sent up to higher command in Bomber Command. It went up as high as the group headquarters. So that wasn't just the squadron or the wing. It went up as high as the group. So it went up two different links in the chain. So it was seen by higher officials. The bathtub was actually seen over the Russian front in 1943. February 1943, that was seen during a huge battle at a place called Krasny Bor, and it was seen by a Spanish division. Now, many in your audience might not know, but there was a division of Spanish volunteers who fought for the Germans against the Russians in 1942 and 1943. And there was a huge battle at a place called Krasny Bor up near Leningrad in 1943. And in the middle of the battle, when German and Russian fighter planes were firing at each other above the battlefield, this thing, which looked like an upturned bathtub, was seen above them, observing them. Wow. So that's where that comes from.
And which just for reference, for researcher purposes, which documents did you find that reference in?
Well, that comes from the Spanish researcher who actually was there at the time. He was a member of that division.
Okay.
And he names not just himself, but he also named several people from the division who saw it. They were in a bunker on the ground witnessing this object. And he became effectively the first Spanish UFO researcher in 1945. He went home when the whole division went home in 1943. His parents had their own UFO encounter in 1945. And he then decided that he wanted to investigate this phenomenon because he wasn't sure what was going on. So that's where that comes from.
I have to say right here, you blew my mind on multiple levels right there, because I was always under the impression that Spain was not involved in the war.
Oh, it was.
Hitler had really
look up what they called the Blue Division, the 250th Infantry Division.
I believe you. I believe you. I just was I was misinformed and believed.
Well, they were neutral. They were neutral. Yeah, they were neutral, but they had volunteers who fought for the Germans.
That fought for the Germans?
Yeah, they fought for the Germans. And then when they were sent home in 1943, some volunteers went back and actually formed a very small SS unit that fought even in the ruins of Berlin in 1945 against the Russians. So yes, they did fight on behalf of the Germans. Some of them did, anyway.
I was not exaggerating when I said Graeme is a historian. On top of his UFO research and aviation study, he is a well-educated, well-studied historian. Thank you for that. That's I learned so much talking to people on this podcast, and when they feed little tidbits of information like that, I get so excited because that's new information to me.
I'll just talk about the blanket if I can, because that was the last thing that you mentioned.
You can. Let me just say real quick hello to Coco, because she's always leaving comments in the show notes for the videos, and I appreciate you watching as much as you do. Coco, thank you for being here. It's great to see you on a live stream. Normally I see your comments because you didn't have a chance to watch it live. You watched the recording of it. Thank you for being here. And if you have any questions, guys, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll get to them.
I'm happy to answer any questions from anybody. That's not a problem. The blanket was seen on the last bombing raid of the RAF in the war. And a crew actually saw what they described as a huge blanket past their aircraft, and at the same time all the electrics on the aircraft failed. The actual bomb, the bomb that they were carrying what they called an earthquake bomb, one of these 12,000-pound tall boys, and it it basically came loose from the clamps and crashed through the bomb bay doors and fell away.
Wow.
So that's quite a story. And I've actually got a recording that was kindly given by an Australian researcher, because it was an Australian pilot, and he was interviewed long after the war. And I've got an audio file of the recording, and I use that just to go into the case as well. And I've done some digging into the case because it's quite interesting. So yeah, you can read it when the book comes out. You can read about that.
So when I just, man, we've got a million rabbit holes that we're going to travel down. So we're probably going to have a part 2 on this, because I don't want to keep you here too late. I was planning on going 90 minutes to 2 hours, if depending on
perfect
listener interactions. The blanket incident where this bomb fell through the bay doors, and the electronics started to go wonky on the plane.
Well, they lost all 4 engines.
That reminds me so much of now the object itself, or the UFO, UAP, whatever you want to call it, itself is different than what was described, but the incident itself is strikingly similar in my mind to incidents over Malmstrom nuclear launch complex in Malmstrom that involved Robert Salas and his crew. Are you familiar with
I
that?
am, yes. I'm familiar with that, yes. It matches a lot of UFO incidents where electrics went dead, even just cars being stopped.
My point was the interaction with the weapon itself.
Oh, yes, that's right, yes.
It was knocking, it knocked the bomb through the bay doors. Very similar in disabling those nuclear weapons.
That's right.
It just like makes you think a little bit deeper, like what is going on with this, and how connected are those events in the past to what happened in the 60s and even today with these phenomena.
It's very true. Yeah, we don't have enough information yet to be able to draw parallels in a lot of cases, but you can look at things and go, yeah, there's a possibility here. Yeah, there's a possibility there.
Right. And like you said, you can't, but you also can't ignore when there are patterns or similarities.
I wouldn't like to rule anything out at this stage.
Exactly. So, were you done? I know you wanted to get into another story, but I have.
No, that's fine. That was the blanket story. That was the last. Okay. That was the last one I had.
That's an interesting story. I want to go back to the records when the records in reference to the reporting of the incidents. So you said that the pilots and the crews would come in and report, and they would sometimes be told, "That's not what you saw. You saw this."
Yeah.
My question is, that also is strikingly similar to the way things have been handled up until 2017, when that New York Times article came out, with the military basically saying, don't ask, don't tell type of a policy. We don't want to know what you saw, but if you tell us what you saw, then we're going to have to investigate it, and you're probably going to lose your pilot's license. So it wasn't reported, but in this situation, it was reported. The people taking the reports, even though there wasn't a formal intelligence community established at that time, there were it was just in the kind of the basic stages of beginning to create an intelligence apparatus. Would you say that those people taking these reports would be kind of the predecessors of the intelligence community?
They were
just the higher ups.
Well, in some respects, they were the predecessors, because they were the ones that were handling all this kind of sensitive information, and they were compiling that information to be passed on to higher authority. But in other ways, they were less clued up than the pilots themselves, because a lot of them were pilots from First World War, or they were crew that had served much earlier in the war and now were no longer flying for various reasons, and the war left them behind. So their experience of combat was quite old. And the equipment they were flying was a lot older and obsolete, so they weren't necessarily clued up a lot about what was happening, even though they were the intelligence officers. Effectively they were just taking information and compiling it and passing it on. So that was their job. But in some cases, in terms of the American night fighter squadrons, they were often giving interviews to the press, there were a lot of war correspondents, what we call that word embedded now, but they were effectively embedded with the US Army Air Force in 1944 and 1945, and they did have access to the crews, or at least through the say-so of the commanding officer. And in some cases, the commanding officer was giving reports to news to the war correspondents and saying, "Oh yeah, we just think it's some kind of German secret weapon." So that was like undermining this kind of like notion that there was something else, because that's, again, everybody did still think that there were German secret weapons. They didn't have any other inkling of what they might have been. That was just what they would be, because that's what they were expecting as well. There was talk of jets and rocket aircraft flying around and new missiles and all the rest of it. It was just a question of when they would appear on the battlefield, not if. So they were expecting this stuff, so they were seeing them, and at least that's what they thought they were seeing. So yes, there was this tendency just to play down stuff as if, yeah, it's a German secret weapon. But the thing was, the German secret weapons like the V2 rocket, even before they started firing it on London, they tested one which crashed on an island off Sweden. So the Allied intelligence got a hold of bits of one, but also there was one that was fired from a test center in Poland that crashed into a nearby river, into a marsh, and the Polish resistance managed to get it and hide it before the Germans could recover it. So, and those parts got back to London as well. So the intelligence, like British intelligence, had bits of weapon to look at and try and work out what was going on, to piece these bits together, to try and work out what kind of rocket it was, how it was fueled, what kind of warhead it had on, what kind of guidance system it used, and all the rest of it. And they managed to work out through this kind of complicated system of just going through various Enigma kind of intercepts about what they were doing with testing, but all these bits they had as well. And they worked out that it was a rocket and it was going to be fired at them shortly. Whereas the Foo Fighters, they had nothing like this. They were all completely in the dark. All they had were just this testimony from the air crews saying that they'd seen these lights, or they'd seen these torpedo-shaped aircraft, or these other things they were seeing. And they had physically nothing else to look at and go, oh yeah, I wonder what this is. What does it do? Well, so that was it.
You mentioned earlier that they were shooting down something.
Well, they said they were shooting down something, yeah.
They said they were shooting down something.
But over Germany.
There was never any crash retrieval.
Never records or anything like that, no. Okay. And this is where you get the photographs. So I might as well talk. Can I just talk about the photographs for a second?
Yes. I know you've been dying to talk about the photographs. Let's hear the photographs. I still have 100 questions for you.
No, that's fine. I'll just get it this way because I'll forget otherwise. Sorry, okay, it's in the back of my head at the moment. Yeah. If you look on the internet and if you go beyond the Wikipedia searches, and I did when I started this off to see what information was around, but you will see images of what purport to be Foo Fighters. Now, most of them are actually taken on the Pacific front. In the Pacific Theater operations, and you'll see these kind of like hazy little blobs of white blobs or black blobs on the photographs. They're probably all film defects, as far as I'm concerned. They weren't physical objects, and the ones I've seen of ones over the European front, so the ones over Germany, there are some famous pictures of where these lights can be seen over bomber formations, over B-17s, and I've actually found the original photograph on a couple of cases where they don't have these lights. They were just they're just fakes. They were done by Photoshop. Mm-hmm. But you'll see them on websites talking about Foo Fighters, or you'll see them on websites talking about Nazi UFOs, all this kind of stuff, and they become accepted as fact because nobody's ever done any kind of digging into, well, are these images, what's the original story behind this image? And they never have any documentation or any kind of chain of custody behind them. So they don't even tell you what aircraft they were half the time. And in some cases, they're wrong about what types they're showing. There's a particular image, and you've probably seen it before. There's two aircraft with a thing in the middle of it. And this thing in the middle is supposed to be the Foo Fighter. And these two aircraft have got like spattered undercarriage, fixed undercarriage. Now, I've seen those labeled as German night fighters, but they're actually Takashi Kai-36 Japanese Army cooperation aircraft. And they only operated over China. So I'm not sure what a Foo Fighter is doing over China, but, it could be right. But that picture, it's probably a blemish or some kind of problem with the developing of the camera of the film. I'm sure Scott would know more about that than I would. But none of them have ever been proved as to being taken, where they were or where they were taken or who took them. They've all got very dodgy provenance behind them, so I wouldn't believe any of them. And as far as I'm concerned, there are no pictures of Foo Fighters. Somebody might come back and prove me wrong, but I haven't come across one where I can go, yeah, okay, there's something behind that picture, and I can tie it down to a place or the photographer, etc. There is one picture, as I said, that I found the original image, and it's got nothing like the one that they show. They've doctored it, but I can tell which unit it was because I know by the markings on the planes which unit it was, the 384th Bomb Group. And that's a famous photograph where you see these three lights with these kind of flares coming up from above and below the lights, but that's actually a faked image. There are some of the reports I've come across, however, do talk about pictures being taken at the time, but I've never seen the images. So there might have been images taken in the war, but they've never seen the light of day.
Wow.
So that's it.
Yeah, if there was, it would be the holy grail of Foo Fighter research.
Possibly, yeah. So hopefully that's interesting to Scott.
Yeah, so get on it, Scott. Go find those Foo Fighter photos, man. Let me just follow up a couple real quick. Coco says, thank you so much, Andrew and Graeme. It's a pleasure to listen to you too. And then she says, we absolutely don't know what are the interactions. We just have to acknowledge it and be aware.
Yep, very true. We don't know what's going on, do we? We just surmise and we anthropomorphize, and we basically just, we're in the dark.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's take a turn towards the rabbit hole. When you first started, as I already talked to you about your goals, what you wanted to do, did you have a working hypothesis that you wanted to prove or disprove outside of what you already?
The only thing I wanted to do was prove what they weren't.
Okay.
So for a while now, I've had it, sort of nailed down that they weren't German UFOs, like flying discs, and they weren't these aerial flak mines that this Italian author came up with. And I've used 3 chapters of the book, and there's about 20 odd chapters in the book. And I've gone into 3 chapters where I've gone into fairly sort of deep detail. I've done a deep dive into those 2 particular subjects to knock them on the head, and just to do it once and for all for people, so that you can't really go, oh well, there's still a possibility. I mean, unless somebody comes up with some documentary evidence that isn't like something that's just been photoshopped or just done on a PC, in the last 20 years, to say that there was some kind of proof behind these things, then that's fair enough. I'll be willing to look at it, but that was my goal. I can't really say what the Foo Fighters were, but that's no big surprise, because people can't even say what UFOs today are. I mean, people claim themselves. Some people claim that they're experts in what the UFOs represent, and they have all the answers, or they say they have the answers to what these things definitely are. And I've had people on Twitter come up and send me pictures of German disc-shaped airplanes, which I've seen before, and I know they're faked. And then they've said, "Oh, this is the answer, and you don't know what you're talking about." And I just shake my head and just think, "Okay, well, where's the evidence?" And they never come up with anything. So I've said what they're not, but what they are is a different thing entirely, because we're going back 80 years. We've got a limited amount of information in terms of reporting, in terms of testimony, and we can't sort of question these people anymore because they're all dead, unfortunately. I should have written this book 30 years ago. I say that quite openly in the book, that this is something I should have looked at. Or
at least started the research 30 years
ago.
Well,
yeah, that's right, yeah. I was interested in aircraft more than UFOs back then, unfortunately. Right. I had a lean spell in the sort of late 1990s, early 2000s in terms of UFOs. So yeah, I should have done it then, you're right. But then again, nobody else was either. So I'm afraid I'm not the only one. And then I did actually come across a book that was written in 2007 on this topic. It covered both Europe and the Pacific. And the bits I could see about Europe, well, actually there is another book, but I'll not go there. This particular book, there were some mistakes in it. And from my point of view, about knowing a little bit about airplanes, there were quite glaring mistakes. I mean, there was one particular thing where this author called this particular airplane a mosquito, well, a Mosquito only had 2 crew in, and yet they were talking about 7 crewmen. Well, that was a Lancaster. So, these things, you just wonder, well, if that's wrong, what else is wrong? So I couldn't help thinking this book needs to be a little bit better. I mean, having said that, it was a great book. It was, as a first frame of reference, it was a really good book, and it did have some interesting stuff in. And I used it as a bit of a springboard to look at more cases, so it was quite helpful in that respect. But I felt those things needed to be addressed as well. So that was another small goal, if you like, that I needed to put things right. I needed to, so that nobody was laboring under a false, kind of apprehension that some of these dates were right or some of these particular types of airplanes were right, because actually, no, they weren't. So I felt that needed to be put straight. But then I say that it went from there, and I just started finding all these reports and the records that hadn't been looked at or hadn't been put down on print before. So it just snowballed. So I found loads.
Yeah. So you started out with no hypotheses, but you had a goal. As you started to dig into this and you started to uncover and basically prove that your theory that these things were something else.
So
but have you started to develop any kind of a hypothesis as to one, are these things not human made, and if they are not human made, are they related in any way to what we're seeing and experiencing today?
As I went through, developed, I suppose develop's not the right word, but I had it in the back of my mind from the very beginning that the Germans couldn't have been responsible for these, and that was one of the goals. But also at the same time, you knew that the Russians couldn't be involved as well, because their technology wasn't nowhere near as on the same level that the Germans had. And similarly for the Americans and the British as well, we didn't have that kind of radical technology. It's said that some of this information is contained in what they call the combined intelligence forms, where they were looking for what technology they could find in Germany after the war and go through the so-called SIOS files to find, all the technology they were working on, all the types of aircraft and all the other systems, and whether that could have been pieced together to put into some kind of weapon that could have been looked like the Foo Fighters. And I guess some of it might have, but not all of it, and not all together at the same time. Bearing in mind, a lot of it was just still in people's heads, and they hadn't really got it nailed down. So one or two of the things that they said that they could find after the war could have been part of something like this, but altogether they didn't have everything together. I know Nick Cook, who wrote Hunt for Zero Point, he mentions in his book about seeing all these different things that he thought could have been pieced together to build something along the lines of a Foo Fighter. But I respectfully disagree with him. I don't think they were that far forward, and I think a lot of the things that were coming up in these reports, even though they said they were working on them, they weren't really working that far ahead on them, and they certainly didn't have working prototypes or anything like that. And there's no documentation to prove that they did. So I think that's a non-starter. So as I went through everything, I was able to prove what things weren't, or to a certain level of, my satisfaction. So I was able to sort of more or less rule out that there weren't German discs or aerial flak mines or a combination or something else along those lines. I was able to rule out the likes of the Russians and definitely the Chinese. I mean, they were still an agricultural nation at that time. Really didn't really have much in the way of heavy industry or technological know-how. The Americans and the British, again, nowhere near that kind of thing. And then their records are much more open in terms of what they were working on back then. So you would know whether there was anything like this squirreled away somewhere. And the Germans just simply didn't have the kind of resources to do that kind of thing either.
You keep talking around the point, Graeme.
I can't, and the reason is because I don't want to give a huge amount away about the book.
Okay, I don't want you to reveal your conclusions.
No,
I was interested in hearing, have you developed any hypothesis, and have you been able to in any way connect what was witnessed and experienced, encountered in the 40s to what's happening today?
If you read the Debrief article, which I wrote in April, and I was already heavily into research by then. I'd already worked out what I thought might be going on. It's the answers written in there.
Okay.
So have a look at the debrief article.
All right. Can you give me a clue? Yes or no?
Well, it's a case of it's a maybe, because it's one of these things where nobody's an expert, are they? So
I thought I did read that article. I don't remember seeing any kind of conclusion.
At the end. I drew parallels between the Foo Fighters and the encounters where they were shooting at them. With I know it's not really I know the Nimitz encounter wasn't really a dogfight, but it was an SPEX thing we've got to one at the moment in the current crop of sightings. So I drew parallels between those. To say that things, although it's what I said before to you, that things might change in terms of developments in aircraft, but really they're still running rings around us, right, whatever these things are. So that's the bit I'm trying to put across, that hasn't changed. Now you can then try and maybe talk about whether there's any parallel between actually what they were and what they are now. Is it the same thing exactly? Well, it might be, but it might not be as well. It's one of those things. We've got no instruction manual. We've got no history books about this. We can't. There's no plan or anything like that. We don't know. We can only guess. So yes, it's possible.
Your statement kind of summarizes the answer to that. In that, as much as UFOs change, they also stay the same.
They do, yeah. And that's effectively what I said in the debrief article, which is what I was getting at there. But that's what I'm saying now as well. And I think I use that line in the book again, so or a variation of it. So yeah, and it's been picked up on by a few people. There's one particular person who's fairly well known at the moment has given me a quote for the book. I'm not going to say who it is. You'll have to read it. But and they've said about maybe looking back at old cases and probably finding parallels. So it's not just me thinking that either.
Coco says the German technology is still very discreet and secret, but quite extended.
Well, it is and it isn't, because even the secret program still had documentation. And I can name it off the top of my head. I can name a few things which maybe some of the audience haven't heard of, but I can access documents and photographs about them. But these things, the discs or the flak mines, there's nothing about them at all. And the pictures on the internet, they're models or they're CGI or whatever like that. There's actually one of a flying saucer. It's got an upside down tank turret. It looked like an airfix kit stuck on the bottom of it. That's just totally impractical. Well, exactly. They've got a Panther tank turret stuck on the underside of it. It's upside down. The practicalities of trying to fire a weapon like that from a flying saucer are ridiculous. So it's just some of them are preposterous. I mean, I don't.
No, they did. The Nazis did develop some wild.
Oh, they did.
The Wunder weapons or whatever they called them.
Yeah, the Wunderwaffe. Yes.
Yeah, Wunderwaffe. Yeah. I mean, they were crazy weapons, but I mean, you have to work within the laws of physics as they know it at the time, right?
They had some even crazier things on the drawing board, which, well, one would never work, and one they tried but didn't. They had what they called a wind cannon. And you can read about this. It's all over the internet. And they did actually build it. It was supposed to knock aircraft out of the sky by firing a kind of jet of gas, which would knock them out of the sky.
No projectile, just a
column of gas. Wow. That would interfere with the aircraft sort of thing and bring them down. But they found it did actually have an effective range of about 200 yards, which isn't very far. So,
I think most planes fly higher than that.
Well, that's very true. So they actually installed, and it was about 45 foot long as well, and it was very unwieldy. Yeah. They installed it next to a bridge, which they wanted to defend in April 1945, but they never used it in anger.
Well, I mean, the sight of a 45-foot long gun is going to be pretty intimidating. Maybe it was more of a deterrent than anything else.
Well, it was a white elephant in terms of resources, because apparently they threw a bit of money at it. And then they also
seems like a lot of the stuff.
There was one other thing. They had a suborbital bomber, a ramjet powered bomber that they had under kind of planning, and it was supposed to take off from a runway in Germany. If you've seen the film When Worlds Collide, the kind of Ark spaceship takes off from Earth when it's about to be destroyed by another planet, and it goes down this kind of rail. It looks like a roller coaster, and goes off, shoots off into space. Well, that's how they were going to launch this thing. It was called the Sanger-Brett ramjet, and it was supposed to be able to bomb New York by skipping across the atmosphere over the Atlantic, and then coming down, and then dropping a bomb on New York, and then returning to base. They reckon that if it was ever built,
was that supposed to be manned or unmanned?
Manned. Oh, it was supposed to be manned, yeah. But they reckon that if they ever built it, it would have burned up on re-entry into the atmosphere because they didn't have it shielded enough.
Yeah, they were thinking outside the box for sure.
Oh, they were, yeah.
The thing that you have to think about is if they were able to come up with the ideas and put those into planning stages, and in some cases actually put them into the developing stages, what are they coming up with nowadays?
Well, very true, yeah. And obviously,
it's just it's been 75 years since the end of World War II. 70, is that right? 75?
About 75 years.
We're pushing pretty close to 75, 76. Better part of a century. And the stuff they were developing at the end of World War II is almost science fiction. And at that time, it was science fiction. What they're doing today that we don't know about, that's top secret. And it's, I don't know that it is a Tic Tac or, even the stuff that we saw that you're talking about in your book. I don't know if we've advanced to that capabilities yet, but it still would be interesting just to get a glimpse of what's going on behind the curtain and see what they're developing. I wanted to talk about, and we could do it briefly, but besides the Foo Fighters, and we talked about it a little bit, besides the Foo Fighters, you, in your research, have you uncovered technology that was in development that is kind of somewhat mythical right now? Like the Diglaka. They say that there was a program for the Diglaka.
Yeah.
There's I've never really seen any hard evidence. And the other one, which I think actually was in development, was the Hanibu, which we touched on briefly.
Nope, neither of them were in development. Again, you come to these dubious sources. So I'll take them each in turn. Diglaka, or the bell, as we call it in English. It was supposed to be in development. It was supposed to be a project for anti-gravity that was hidden in an underground facility in Silesia, which is now Poland. And it comes from a single source. It comes from one Igor Witkowski, who's a Polish researcher, but also an author of some. Well, I've seen some of his work, some of his earlier work, and he wrote some books on German secret weapons, just like what you call ordinary secret weapons, jets and rockets, and some reviewers have said that some of these are dodgy in terms of his sources and some of the information that he was putting out about these weapons, which people know about. And I've read a couple of these books, and I wasn't entirely convinced by what he was saying about some of these weapons either. It's a while since I've read the last one I read, but I remember being a bit kind of, that's a bit kind of suspect. I think he was trying to put a bit too much into the stories about these weapons, because a lot of information is known about the jets and the jet projects and the missiles and the missile projects, but I think he was trying to take things one step further about how far some of these have been developed. So I think it was a little, if you sort of take some of the things with a pinch of salt. And then he also talks about this source that he's supposed to have got the information from, or the person who was this Jakob Sporenberg, was an SS official, that these documents are supposed to have come from, that's supposed to prove the existence of this project about the bell. Turns out Sporenberg was actually an SS police leader who was more concentrating on anti-partisan warfare in Poland, tracking down partisans and deporting people to camps, than he was to do with secret weapons programs. And actually, before the end of 1944, he was sent off to Norway to do the same thing anyway. So he wasn't even around that part of Poland at the end of the war. So you look at things like that and you just wonder how much of this is really true and how much is this like in somebody's active imagination. Maybe not the the Polish guy, but maybe people feeding this stuff to him. I mean, when I first heard about this story back in the late 90s, before Nick Cook wrote the book about the hunt for Zero Point, it sounded like an amazing story. And for somebody like me who's been interested in German secret weapons, for as long as I can remember, for like 40 years or more, it was one of those kind of dream come true kind of stories. When I first heard about the Nazi UFOs, you think, what, really? So you want to know more. And of course, my curiosity gets the better of me a lot of the time, and I just want to dig in about these stories. But I never found anything that rang true, nor can I find anything that would stand up in terms of documentation. And so I have that about the Bell. It's a lovely story, but I can't find any truth to it. And it ticks a lot of boxes in terms of German secret weapons and anti-gravity research and possible German links to UFOs, because they're all really, really sexy subjects when you talk about UFOs, because everybody loves a nice Nazi angle to anything nowadays. But I think that, you know what I mean? It's always been like... It's always been a go-to thing for people, hasn't it? That, in films or science fiction or even just anything else you can think of. It's always been a great thing to put a handle on things. Yeah. So it was always a great story, and it ticked a lot of boxes, but it never rang true. And still today, I'm really, really suspect. And actually, Nick Cook himself has been quoted, in the last few years. He spoke to my colleague Dave Partridge at Shadows of Your Mind magazine, and I believe he told him that he wasn't entirely sure that was what it was anymore. He thought it was something to do with the Nazi nuclear program. So even people who back then who were maybe sort of told by other people that's what it was, I think they're sort of like shying away from it now.
That is another angle to the UFO topic that we didn't even touch on. The Nazis were developing they had their own nuclear program. They weren't as advanced, but yeah. But still, there's that connection between UFOs.
Yeah, and it's more likely that it was to do with that than it was to do with anything else. But then again, there was a whole load of underground facilities all over Germany, and they were primarily concerned with just building jet fighters or missiles or V2s or V1s. They weren't doing much else with them. So it's entirely possible that this mine that they converted into a whole rabbit warren of tunnels and things was just to do with that or something along those lines. And this fly trap contraption, this circular kind of what looks like what they call the henge, I believe there's another name for it. There's talk it was just the foundations for a water tower, and that's more likely to be the prosaic answer.
Exactly.
I'm not trying to debunk it, but I think that's pretty much what it was. Whatever they were doing down there needed a lot of power, but that's the way to get it. And you have cables coming up through the floor, through the roof of this building into this water tower or whatever. That makes more sense than it does for some elaborate kind of anti-gravity machine, which nobody's ever seen hiding a hair of after the war, and there's no documentation. Nobody has ever been able to provide any eyewitness testimony as to what they did. And anything that comes out of the woodwork now, you're probably just trying to treat with a big pinch of salt. So that's the Bell. So that's that side of things. And what I've lost track. What was the other one that you mentioned?
We'll get to it. The Honeydew.
Okay. The Honeydew. Yeah. Again, that's just under the German flying saucers thing. Again, there's no documentation. There are plans, but those plans surfaced in the late 1960s, and they're very heavily associated with neo-Nazi groups from that time. And there's people who got information from these kind of shadowy groups and newsletters and all the rest of it. But again, they've got no kind of chain of custody that you can follow. And there's there's nothing to pin them to certain places or certain times. They look wonderful and they sound wonderful, but they're also parceled up with the Germans trying to contact people on Debrief and all this other rubbish there is. There was a documentary back in the 1990s on VHS called UFO Secrets of the Third Reich. I even had a copy myself back then, and it was all rubbish. Even then, I was looking at this going, "Come on!" I think I've wasted my money buying this. It was
although, don't dismiss the fact that the Nazis did have an affinity leaning towards the occult. They were
they did.
Very
some
interested
of them did.
in uncovering some of that esoteric information. But
a lot of
I don't want to get too far afield. I want to get back to the Bell real quick, because Christopher Plain, who's a fellow writer of yours at the Debrief. How you doing, Chris? Thanks for showing up.
Science writer for the Debrief. Hello, Chris.
Yeah, for sure. And he knows a lot about this stuff. Being a science writer, he talks to a lot of scientists, people working on the cutting edge of, or the bleeding edge, as he calls it, of science and technology. Even if the bell is made up folklore, there does seem to be an anti-gravity theme around a lot of secret third-rank research. Have you found evidence to support that?
Not like something I can get my hand on. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence. People saying things happen and pointing out places and facilities where things like this might have happened. But again, it's so sketchy, and that information would have probably been in the SIOS files, because they were digging into everything at the end of the war. They were looking through all the facilities, even the destroyed ones, looking for evidence of anything they could find that the Germans were working on. And you can read those files. They're in the actual Air Force archives, the SIOS files. You can read through them all, and you can see all the projects. So from advanced aeronautics through to possible kind of spacecraft, as in the rocket programs, and you can see things like medical kind of technologies that we're working on. All anything you can think of, it's in there. But anti-gravity is not necessarily in there. Yes, they were looking at ways of trying to fly things in different ways. They were looking at all types of propulsion. So they weren't just looking at jets. They were looking at pulse jets. They were looking at ram jets. They were looking at powering jets by powdered and liquefied coal and liquefied gas. They were looking at all weird and wonderful things. And they had a disc-shaped aircraft in World War II. It was only the one prototype, and it didn't fly very well. But it did. A farmer, would you believe, came up with a design, and they did fly it, but it only hopped off the runway. That's about as close as they got to a disc-shaped anti-gravity machine. So I have to be. I'm afraid I don't want to really disagree with Chris, but I just don't think they were that far advanced. They might have thought about a lot of this stuff, and there might have been some kind of theoretical kind of thinking about what was happening, but I'm yet to be convinced by any kind of documentation to that actually happened. And if he or somebody else really wants to point something in my direction that I can look at, I'll be only too glad to have a look and reevaluate my opinion on that. But I've been looking for this kind of stuff for years now, and I've never seen it, or I've never heard of anybody else who has. Again, it's just anecdotal evidence.
And Chris says, "Yep, really hard rumors to track down, Graeme." So it does seem that he agrees with you. And I think anti-gravity is still yet to be solved, as far as we know.
I think if they were working on it back then, and the American, like say you discovered it, because or we discovered it in Britain, it would have been in a report somewhere. Yes, okay, it might not have been put forward for public consumption, but we'll be seeing the fruits of it now, openly. I think enough years have gone past since the end of the war that there would have been a practical application for it, and it would have been unveiled somehow, either by you or by us or by the Russians, because chances are they might have got a hold of that kind of thing as well. If it was, if you got a hold of it, chances are they did. They certainly got a hold of a share of the spoils after the war. They had their own kind of project called Paperclip, where they spirited away scientists and technicians in the middle of the night in 1946. They did exactly the same as the Americans did. They did exactly the same as the Brits did. We all had our little projects to get a hold of what information we could, and they spirited off whole factories off to Russia as well, and worked on stuff. But nothing that comes out now. Yes, it is. You're right, Chris. That is true.
Let me read that for the people listening. Anti-gravity is listed. Chris Plain says anti-gravity is listed as a currently under development project in the 9-page.
But that's under development, isn't it? We're not looking at, it's a hell of a lead time for a project. If you're looking at 80 years for something like that to happen, you would have thought a lot more might have happened by then. And they would be a bit more open with it because all the practical applications it can have. I don't think it's a runner in terms of World War II and the Germans coming up with something like that. I'm afraid. And even putting it to any kind of use in a kind of disc-shaped craft or object, I'm afraid I just don't subscribe to that. Someone tomorrow might come up with something cast iron documentation that can't be debunked, and I would go, yeah, okay, I hold my hands up and go, yeah, sorry, you've got me. but
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, that's the sign of a true researcher right there, is that you're willing to, you'll take a position on something until something else comes along to alter your position on that, and that's a smart way to be.
Well, I've always said to people that I'll just go where the data takes me. Yeah. I do that with all the facets of the UFO subject. I've never been somebody to actually get welded to any particular position, because I feel if you ever do that, then when the information changes, people seem that and I've seen it from other people, they're forced to defend their position, and that's when they start digging themselves in deeper and deeper holes,
and that's
because they can't move from the position. Yeah, it does. Right. But that's when the arguments start as well. Right. And then also where your credibility just goes out the window. So, and I don't want that to happen to me. I'd rather be somebody who says, I don't know. It's easier for me to say I don't know than to try and concoct some weird and wonderful tale about what I think's going on and then try to defend it.
It's even safe to say, based on the information that I have available, this is my position on that. I rarely do that. I don't like to give my opinion on things because I feel ill-informed to have an opinion on most things. But I know that people are like, you have done so much research in this. People look to you as an authority on certain areas of the research that you've done. So for you to take a position, that's legitimate. I think that but for you to be flexible enough to say, if new data presents itself, I can alter my position. Nobody's going to disrespect you for that. I mean, if they did, then that person has some serious issues that they need to work out. So we're getting to almost to 2 hours, and I know you're 8 hours ahead of me, so it's getting close to what, about 9?
9? Yeah, 5 to 9. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and start wrapping this up, unless anybody in the chat room has questions. I see somebody that I don't recognize, CTXV, something about a scam. I saw you mention Red Mercury earlier.
Yeah, it might well be about documentation. It might have been for sale, to do with what's supposedly going on. But there's been people throughout the last 30, 40 years who have come up with various plans, documents, photographs, all the rest of it, and try to sell them through books. I mean, I've even got some of the books. I've bought them for reference purposes over the years, just to see what people say about the topic. And then half the time I'm looking and going, no. But it's useful to have them, because I like to see what the opposition say.
If it in any way points you in the right direction to find information that supports then that it's worth it.
And I don't rule them out either. When I first start reading them, I just think, okay, well, I'll try and have as an open mind as I can about what you're saying. But I usually get so far in, I go, no, sorry.
Yeah, secret anonymous sources don't really cut it as evidence.
No, they don't. No, I'm afraid not. It's all. They're great stories. Yeah, they're wonderful stories. Don't get me wrong. And years ago, when I talk about those aerial flak mines, that Italian author that came up with this book in 1968, I bought that book 35 years ago. I managed to find a copy in a second-hand bookshop, and it was back at that time when I was looking at it, and it wasn't that I believed him, but it was one of those things where I'd love to believe this, because it's quite seductive in a way, thinking that the Germans had this advantage, which for some reason they didn't use. And it's one of those kind of fantasies that a lot of people have in films and books, where the Germans were just that close to winning the war, but it didn't happen. Or sometimes in alternative fiction, they do. Right. So I'm a fan of alternative history. I like my science fiction that way. So that is quite appealing to me. But that's as far as it goes. I'm not going to start going down a road where I develop some kind of theory to say, yeah, that really happened. They did have all this technology, which for some reason they never used and won the war. They just preferred to hide it away somewhere for God only knows why. So yeah, I refuse to go down that road. Unlike some people who have produced books on the subject, trying to justify why the Germans supposedly had this technology. Had it to the point of where it was flying around at 1,300 miles an hour and all the rest of it, and just never used it against the Allies. Yeah, righto. That doesn't stand up whatsoever.
Got a couple questions from the chat. Scott Brown says, has Graeme ever looked at the round structure that people have claimed was used for testing the Nazi bell?
So that's the henge. That's the fly trap, they call it. That's above the Wenceslas mine in Silesia, in what's now Poland. I would love to go and see it one day. It's fairly easy to get to, but at the moment I can't. It's really difficult traveling with COVID, etc. But I would like to go and see it just with my own eyes. But I have seen documentaries that have shown it. Nick Cook, who was spoke about, he did a really good documentary based on the book Hunt for Zero Point. It was shown in the UK back in 2005, I believe. I was really interested in that documentary. It's actually on YouTube. You can see it. And this Igor Witkowski, his contact who told him about this supposed project, he takes him round the site so you can see it and you can see what it looks like. And they go down into the mine and the tunnels. But there's nothing there, so you can't tell anything was ever developed down there. So it's a lovely story coming from this Polish guy. But as to how true it is, I'm not convinced.
So you never ran across any documentation to support the idea that
nobody else has.
A bell was even in development at the time.
Nobody else has either.
That structure you had said earlier that you think it was probably the support structure for a water tower.
Well, I'm not the first person.
Something along those lines. Yeah.
I'm not the first person to say that. That came out a lot. About the same time that people were looking at it and going, well, that resembles what I've seen elsewhere as the foundations for a water tower in another facility. So the people were drawing parallels straight away with other sites around Germany where they built similar kind of structures. So you sort of wonder from that, well, okay, how true is this? And the Polish author had I'd say he had a bit of a track record with some of his earlier publications that it might not have entirely been, 100% accurate. I can't guarantee that, but from what I remember about reading his stuff, some of it was a bit kind of, okay. How you read something and you get that kind of feeling, this is not quite right. So
okay, I'm going to hold you over a little bit. I promised to get you out of here after 2 hours, but there's still a couple questions, and I want to do a little bit to close this out. So I'm going to hold you over a little bit. Chris Plain says, does Graeme have any indication that other governments are working on anti-gravity, possibly the UK?
No proof, but indications, I'm sure they are. If you want my opinion on that, I guess that would be something that's like a holy grail, isn't it? So if they are, then they're doing it in secret somewhere. But yeah, it would be daft not to be even just theorizing about it. But as to how far they are down that road, your guess is as good as mine.
Chris also asks, has Graeme ever told the story of how he joined the Debrief?
Have I told it? Well, I don't know. Do you know how I started?
I don't know. No, I haven't heard that story. Go ahead.
I basically I pitched an idea to MJ, and he came back and he went, yeah, and he just told me how to write. He said he just showed me the format, how to write it, and I thought, yeah, that sounds good. So I went from there, and then I pitched another article to him, and then he came and he started asking me to write things. And I mentioned just in passing about the Foo Fighters one day, and he messaged me straight back and went, and this is MJ Benias, sorry, I'm talking about, who's the editor. And he wants, and he came back to me straight away and said, Foo Fighters. He says, oh, sounds really interesting. We'd better do an article about that. Yeah, sure. So that's how that one came about. I must admit, I haven't written anything recently, but I tend to write things I'm interested in. And I've been working full time on this book, so I'm afraid I've been a bit deficient in writing stuff for the Debrief at the moment. But I hope to get back to that very shortly.
So go a little bit deeper into that. How did you learn about the Debrief, and how did you get in contact with MJ Benias?
How did everybody? There was a huge announcement, wasn't it, at the end of November last year?
That's right.
Coincided with my birthday. So they announced this big project that Micah and Tim and MJ were working on, and they were going to have this big reveal and this big story. And sure enough, it was really interesting. But it wasn't just about the UAP news. It was all the science news and all the technology news. It was really, really exciting. And it still is. There's some really groundbreaking stories that they cover. And Chris is their head science writer. And the material he comes out with is really good. They've got some great writers. And I just saw an opening that there was something and it was to do with a British drone, a kind of stealth aircraft. And I thought, yeah, I could write that. I just wonder whether they'll be interested. So I said I just sent a copy of it to MJ, and he went, "Yeah, that's great." So there we go.
Christopher says
Seriously,
MJ
I
thought he
didn't.
was.
You don't know what? I did not
Hold on,
know.
hold on.
I did not know
Let
that.
me read it. And MJ thought he was pitching an interview with Dave Grohl.
Yeah, of course he did.
That's the lead singer for the Foo Fighters, founder of the Foo Fighters, the band. In case anybody doesn't.
Thanks for that, Chris.
Yeah, Chris is great. He was on the show a couple weeks ago. Actually, it might have been last weekend. I don't know. I lose track of time. But he had me in stitches.
Yeah, he's had me hook, line, and sinker there.
He's a crack up, man. He's a good guy. So we'll go ahead, and if you guys have any more questions, we'll knock them out before I cut him loose. But I'm gonna let you have an opportunity to share final thoughts. But before you do that, actually, I've got kind of a little format that I like to follow. So, what are you excited about? Any announcements you want to make? Is there something that you just are dying to share with people?
Okay, so the book is going to hopefully be out shortly, as in maybe within the next month. The last thing that needs to be done is there's a foreword, and I have somebody writing it at the moment who I'm not prepared to share who that person is, but everybody will know who he is. So it's a he. I'll just let that out of the bag. So once it's written,
can I have 3 guesses?
No, I'm not gonna give anything. I'm not giving anything else away.
Fair enough.
The person who's writing it, I'm just waiting for that to be finished, and then when that is, then it'll be out within a week or two after that, and also hopefully the people will be quite impressed with the cover as well. That's all I'm about to say on that. So
Do we know the artist?
I've had
is the artist
no again.
on?
I'm not going to say anything more on that. But what I'm going to say is I've had, in terms of the foreword and the cover, I've had some really, really good help, and I'm really grateful to everybody who helped with both those sides of the book. So they know who they are. Thank you very much.
So no definitive date, but hopefully within a month.
Hopefully,
at least before Christmas. Okay. And then on the topic of Foo Fighters and everything that we talked about, and we covered a lot of information. What are your final thoughts? What do you want people to take away from this?
So, I wanted to dispel the myth that it was just that limited time frame and that limited number of squadrons and just American squadrons that were seeing these things. Yes, okay, the Foo Fighters name was just labeled to a small number of crews and a small number of sightings. But actually, there were more than that. And not just from other air forces and other years and other parts of the world, but the squadrons who they were saying that this happened to, that actually was even wider than it was first thought. And of course, not just these lights, but there were other things involved. So your torpedo-shaped objects, bathtubs, all the rest of it. It was a much bigger phenomenon, which had gone along a lot earlier. And actually, 1942 wasn't the earliest either. There are reports that go back to 1940. So it was a right across the wall. Now, I'm not claiming to say what they were definitively, but I hope I have been able to tell people who read the book what they weren't. And that if I can do anything to help this topic and to also help people across ufology understand what was happening back in the Second World War, that's the thing I'd like to be remembered for, is that I've tried to put across what they weren't. So people can then just put that to one side and go, well, those are lovely stories, but they're not that. So what are they? And also using my kind of research and the information I've got in the book as a springboard for people to dig into their own archives of information, and maybe if they have relatives who have documentation from the war in terms of logbooks, etc., they can start going through those, or if they know anybody else who has this kind of information, they can start looking through this information themselves and maybe find out these little nuggets of information that they can then bring forward and add to the narrative. And I would love if people do that.
I know you're super busy with the book. You're trying to wrap it up and get it out to the public. After that, I'm sure you're gonna have a huge campaign to promote the book. What are your plans? You already mentioned it, that you're gonna have to do a follow-up to cover what was going on in the Pacific. What are your plans? Have you started drawing up any? No, nothing.
Nothing yet.
No
I've got
plans.
things in my head. I've got a few things in my head, but it'll probably go along the same format as the one I've got now. But obviously, I don't need to use the German like secret weapons angle, so it might be a bit more straightforward in terms of just the reporting, but the sources will be the same. I'll still dig into the US records like I've done with this, and also the RAF records. Guesses are free.
Let me read it. Let me read it. Christopher Plain says, so what does Graeme think the Foo Fighters were? Come on, guesses are free.
Do you know what? I genuinely, I know I can guess, but my guess could be wrong, and I don't know enough still after looking through all these tens of thousands of documents.
Let's put that question back on Chris. Chris, you're a science-minded guy. What do you think they were, or are? If they're still in existence.
If they're anything, I mean, this is about as far as I'm prepared to go. If there were anything, they're probably an earlier manifestation of what happened in the 50s, the 60s, 70s, you name it. Yeah. But that's as far as I can go, and that's only a logical progression. But the way I look at it is, and this is something I've thought about for years, things have only been so far ahead of the current technology when these reports was mentioned. So if you go back to the 1890s and these mystery airships, the technology wasn't much further forward, these mystery airships, than what was being developed at the time. And then you have the ghost rockets, the ghost aircraft that were seen in the 20s and 30s. Aircraft that were heard more than seen in unbelievable weather that no self-respecting or sane pilot would fly in, and yet they were still seeing or hearing these aircraft. But that was just, and they were told they were classed as aircraft because they sounded like the droning aircraft noise. So that was technology maybe just ahead of what we had. And then in the war, it was these rockets or lights, but they weren't hostile, but they weren't demonstrating zipping off in the direction like a Tic Tac did. And the flying saucers that were seen in the 50s, what they're called, the flying saucers, they demonstrated a technology just a bit ahead or way ahead of jet fighters. And now we've got these Tic Tacs, which are, again, another leap ahead. So I think, if anything, it might have been progressing, but it's still, many steps ahead of what we have. So That's why I don't think they're ours. But as to what they are, I can't go there. I don't want to get into the habit of just throwing ideas out there and see which ones stick. Because I don't know. I really don't know.
There's enough speculation out there to go around, and adding more noise to the conversation doesn't help it. I totally agree.
I'd rather add details and information and let others decide. And if people want to pick holes with opinions, that's fine. But I don't really want to be someone who gives them too much, because I know somebody will shoot them full of holes, and I would anyway to my own. But I'm just not prepared to go there. I'm prepared to put information out there, and if people want to start having a go at the information, then that's fair. But they'll have to start putting up, counter kind of, sort of information of their own to prove what I've sort of said is wrong. And I'm happy for them to do that. But then also for somebody to come along after reading my book to say, oh well, it was just a secret weapon. Yeah. It was just a German disc. It was an air flight.
That means they didn't read the book.
Well, I know they might have read it, but they're going to have to start coming up with some serious proof.
Yeah.
And I don't want to sound arrogant here, but they're going to have to come up with proof of their own, and something that actually people can look at and go, okay, that sounds plausible. That looks really, kosher. Otherwise, no. I'm sorry, but you're just adding to the noise, as you said. You're just coming up with anecdotal stuff that can't be proven. And that's not information, that's just noise.
It's not helpful, bottom line.
No, not at all.
That's not helpful. Coco says, I agree with Graeme. Every phenomenon after the Second World War was exponential. So I think she means it started to advance. It seems like the technology of our own technology started to advance exponentially post World War II. And I totally agree with that. And I think a big catalyst for that was the competition between the Soviet Union and the U.S. That has been my own personal perspective on that, how our technology has advanced so far, so fast in such a short period of time. that's just my opinion. That's one of the few opinions that I'll share openly, publicly. And then Chris points out that everything you were talking about the phenomena points towards it being a psychological phenomena.
It's possible.
It is possible, Chris.
But a lot of people must have been having hallucinations or some kind of problems to see this. And yes, there were stress-related factors throughout the war, but I don't know. There's just such a wide variety of things, and consistently as well, that if that was the case, we probably have to ground a lot of these pilots. And some particular squadrons, especially in the ones who were flying from Italy and bombing places in Romania and Hungary, were seeing these things night after night. They weren't calling them lights; they were calling them rockets, and these things were flying past their aircraft at 20-odd thousand feet, and they weren't, and they were being reported time after time after time. So there was something there, because if crews were regularly reporting things that couldn't be seen and it was just figments of imagination, then that kind of psychological problem would have manifested itself in other ways. It would have affected performance. And they were always, the squadrons and the officials were always after peak performance, peak efficiency, and they would have weeded out these people. It happened in other ways. People went, they went bomb happy, or they went crazy. It happened quite a lot, and they were removed from duty. Yeah, exactly. Everything, you name it. They were removed from duty pretty quickly if you were aircrew or you were a pilot. Right. Because your crews had to work together.
Because it does affect more than your perception. It affects your ability to perform. Yeah.
To function, exactly. So they would be found out very, very quickly, and yet pilots and crews just kept going, but reporting this stuff all the time.
He follows up or counters.
Yeah, sorry.
I meant the fact that the advanced flight systems seem to always be just ahead of current tech, and indicate a psi phenomenon. I see. Okay, so
from their side, yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, that
makes more sense. Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that, Chris.
Yeah, it's possible.
Cool. All right. So, Graeme, anything that you would like to say before we leave off? Now, I put your links down in the bottom. Your link tree links to all of your articles, your website, your Twitter and Facebook account is all in there. Do you have a YouTube channel?
No, I don't. No. I contribute to Baptiste Fricourt's Back to Basics and the EU for UAP channels. Cool. So I'm asked on his show a few times.
Isn't he the French? Isn't he the guy in France that's doing? He does a lot of translation stuff for his country. He does
a lot of translation in the middle of the night sometimes. We've just finished a 3-part investigation into the Belgian Black Triangle sightings of the late 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So we had a Belgian chap called Julien Oudor. He was really interesting with the information he had.
Yeah.
So
he does have a good channel. Is his channel only in French?
No, it's in English. The EU for UAP, a lot of it's in English, and the Back to Basics, all that was in English. So yes, it's quite accessible for non-French speakers.
So if you don't have a link to that YouTube in your link tree, would you add that to it? Since you're doing
I'll remember. Yeah, that's fine.
That'll be helpful.
As far as just final things, I'm part of UAP Media UK, so our website is UAP Media UK. And just do an internet search for that.
Is that a .com? That's a .com, right?
It's uapmedia.uk.
Oh, okay.
So you can look at that, and it's not just me writing there. We've got a couple of other writers in the group, but it includes Andy, who's that UAP podcast, Dave Partridge, who is Shadows of Your Mind magazine, and I would encourage anybody who's curious about the UFO and paranormal subjects to download that magazine for free.
Yeah,
so that's Shadows of Your Mind.
And do Dave a favor, buy him a coffee, man, because it puts a ton of work into that.
It's all free as well. Yeah, he puts his heart and soul into that magazine. I've just written something about the Calvin UFO from 1990. That was published in there, so that might be of interest to some people. And then we have some people like Adam Goldsack, who's our activist, and we have Chris Sharp, who's our comms guy, and we have Dan the Zignal, who you might know, who's an amazing artist as well. So we have quite a lot of different different strands throughout the organization, but we all work together on various projects. So yeah, they're all worth following on Twitter themselves. So yeah, I'll give a shout out for them.
As well as the debrief, are you going to be putting out any more articles?
And the debrief, yeah. Okay. So I've got something that I'm working on for them, which I talked to MJ a few weeks back, and he said, just keep it under your hat for the time being. It's nothing like really exciting, but it was just something that he didn't want to flood the market with, because it's related in a loose way to something that has already been published, which is right up my street kind of thing. So might be written by the end of the month if I can get around to it in time. But it'll come out hopefully at some stage. So that might be worth reading.
Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody in the chat for contributing to the conversation, for being here and watching. If you guys like the show, please like it and subscribe. Please share the channel and help us grow the subscribers and help the channel get more eyes on it. Jack Ryan just dropped in. Hey, Andrew, Graeme always brings class to whatever panel he's on, and it's not just because of his accent.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah,
I'm English, but I've got a curious accent. It's called Geordie. It's like a North of England accent. So I'm surprised you don't need subtitles.
It's not bad. I can understand. I've talked with a couple of people from the UK. I won't say who, but some people have really hard accents to understand.
Yeah, if I'm taught, because I don't use the word I, sometimes I just say and that's a kind of Geordie thing. Yeah. So sometimes when I'm getting more into what I'm talking about, it creeps in a bit, and I do try to sort of tone it down. But I could get quite real broad Geordie, and then you'd have no chance.
No, man, you're easy to understand, man. I had no trouble at all. Some people might, but I got you.
Yeah.
So, yes, thank you again, Graeme, for being here. I definitely want to have you come back on once you launch the book, and you want to get some eyeballs on it. Christopher Plain asked when is it? He asked if it's available for pre-order, but I'm going to say when will it be available?
I'm not that sophisticated, Chris. I'll just put an announcement on Twitter when it comes out. And then you can just order a copy straight away. Then
okay.
I'm not set up for pre-orders, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's rough, man. Once you start getting pre-orders, then you can't go back. You can't hold the presses, man.
It's coming out one way or another. So it's just I'm just waiting on something happening, and then it'll be out. So I'm sitting at the moment just not writing. It's actually quite strange at the moment. I've been writing like constantly on one thing or another since about last October, and this is the first time I've actually had a few days where I've not actually sort of put pen to paper kind of thing, or keyboard, fingers to keyboard. So yeah, it's a bit weird. I don't like it. I'm gonna have to go back and start writing something very, very soon, as in tomorrow.
How close to retirement are you? You're like days away from retiring, aren't you?
I'm only 54, so I am about 2 weeks tomorrow away from very, very, very early retirement. I've worked
Is it etched in stone now? You're definitely
my
retired?
resignation letter's in and everything. I'm out.
Well, congrats. Early congrats, but yeah, definitely.
I've 26 years and now in National Health Service, so it's time to go.
Awesome, man. Very cool. All right, Graeme, that's enough. I'll let you go, man. It's a pleasure. Always a pleasure talking to you.
And to you. Thank you.
Take care. And have a good night, everybody. I forgot what else.